Hi there. Thanks for having me, everyone. I'm Nic Walker. I look after sustainability at Space Ape Games. And by way of context, we're a mobile game studio in London of about 130 people. We've been trying to do the right thing about sustainability since 2019, which is around the same time that we joined the Playing for the Planet Alliance. With a nod to Jamie and Elizabeth's brilliant talk earlier about every job being a climate job, my day job is not in sustainability. We don't have a full-time position or a team dedicated to it with the size that we are. I've got about 10 minutes, as we heard, to give a quick dive into the world of carbon accounting, net zero, and all that good stuff from the perspective of us as a mid-sized studio. And that is a huge amount to cover. So I thought what I'd do is give what I hope is a decent overview of what you have to do to embark upon this journey towards net zero. Let's start with the problem it is that we're trying to solve with all this stuff. Like fundamentally, our studios emit these greenhouse gases. We buy things as businesses that emitted greenhouse gases in their manufacture. We sell things that emit greenhouse gases because we're either running them in the cloud or on the internet, or we're shipping sometimes boxed products around the globe. And the people we work with to make and look after these products, they emit greenhouse gases too. In the course of their work, they commute or they travel for work on polluting planes, or they need such luxuries as a warm office to work in. And the more that we think about these emissions, the more overwhelming it can feel. Like, what's the impact of our studio on the climate? What can we do about it? Are we the bad guys? Now, like all big problems, it's good to break it down. It's good to start by measuring what we can. We want to use a globally recognized, standardized process to do this. And once we've measured our footprint, we're in a great position then to reduce it. We can see where the fat is. Where can we trim? We might choose some different suppliers who are greener. We might take some concrete actions to change our products to be less polluting. We might find a way to improve the efficiency of some parts of our business. And finally, we can offset what we absolutely have to emit. Now, I'm going to briefly touch on these steps, mostly 1 and 3 in the list there, to give you a flavor of what lies within, from our perspective at Space Ape. First up, obviously, is measure. We want to measure our carbon footprint, our inventory first. As I said, we use a standard to measure our carbon footprint. It's great when everyone uses the same process, right? We use these standards, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. They give this framework for how to think of your carbon footprint. They're an exciting read. I thoroughly recommend you download them. They are genuinely like eye-opening. You're like, oh, okay, that's how it works. That's how it works. Here's a diagram of how the Greenhouse Gas Protocol divides things up. You can see lots of different categories there, representing all the different activities that make up your carbon footprint. Now, one thing to think about here is that your carbon footprint, it isn't like just like emissions from your office or whatever. It's emissions from your business activities. These include emissions from services you pay for, one end of things that are sort of upstream from your business, things like cloud emissions or the waste you generate, or and things like that, right? It also includes the impact of your products on the environment. As Kieran was talking about, you can do an analysis using this kind of thing. You can do an analysis of a product, like what's the life cycle emissions of product? And a lot of that is in the use of that product. So, for example, if your product consumes electricity, as games do, because they run on phones or consoles, or if they run on a device that emitted CO2 when it was built, like pretty much every device out there, you're on the hook to measure those emissions as part of your life cycle emissions. As you can imagine, it can all get pretty complicated. These bubbles are the kinds of things that we're measuring and accounting for at Space Ape. Again, given our size, this is what we're measuring. But the more you look at it, the harder it is to know when to stop measuring. Like, where's the balance of like cost benefits here? When you're a very large organization, you can have dedicated teams. And the smaller you are, the less time you have to spend looking at some things which might not necessarily have the bang for buck that you're looking for. Thankfully, there is a lot of help out there in terms of picking exactly what to include. There's free training out there on some of the greenhouse gas protocol stuff. There's blog posts, there's guidance people write up. But one thing still absent is something specifically to help the games industry. However, there are lots of big cogs turning. I see it in Playing for the Planet Alliance. I see it from Yuki. Soon, I think we'll start to see sector-specific guidance that gives us some real anchor points for like what we should be measuring and what everyone else is measuring. And that's good. So let's imagine we've gone through this process. We're out the end of it, and out pops your carbon footprint. It's like 1,000 tons or 10,000 or whatever. Now, here's where things are changing. Because in the old days, by which I mean like a handful of years ago, you'd have gone out and bought some carbon offsets from someone. They might be things like solar cookers or water filters for communities or clean cook stoves, right? That would otherwise use fossil fuels or wood to inefficiently like kind of boil water and emit CO2, right? And after buying these project credits, I suppose, you get to say that without your money, that 1,000 tons of CO2 would have been emitted, right? You're clean now. You've avoided emitting 1,000 tons of CO2. You're carbon neutral. But with this urgency, the growing urgency of this climate crisis, this more aggressive standard has been gaining traction, that of science-based targets and getting to net zero carbon. And this is something really nicely defined by the Science-Based Targets Initiative from the same people who bought you those awesome greenhouse gas protocol standards. So this often gets reduced to SBTI. So if I say that in a minute, that's what I mean. Science-Based Targets Initiative. They say, look, you've got to set targets for your company or your country or your organization, and you've got to have a plan to reduce your emissions so that they're commensurate with 1.5 degrees of warming of the climate. And net zero in that context is reducing your emissions so that you're consistent with that. And whatever is left over, you've got to remove that excess carbon from the atmosphere. Now, there's still quite a bit of debate over exactly what counts as carbon removal. There's a great Oxford paper and an organization there, Oxford University, doing a lot of good work on what counts and what's useful in this space. A popular view, and I do subscribe to it, is that you have to buy carbon removal credits. You can't have these avoided emissions offsets of the kind like these solar cookers and things like this. And these credits, they're really, really expensive. They're also pretty futuristic. And this talks to what Jamie and Elizabeth were talking about earlier. I think there's a bit of pragmatism needed here. What people are doing, they're setting targets within SBTI for the future, 2025, 2040, 2050 even. And they're betting that carbon removal will get a whole lot cheaper and more available by then. And that will be combined with this huge reduction in their emissions from their value chain, where, you know, the decarbonised electricity grids and a greener supply chain will help everyone get there. So next year, Space Ape, we're going to dive into setting some targets. We don't know how it's going to go yet. We're going to see if we can embark upon this journey to net zero alongside like luminaries like Sony and Microsoft, who are doing such great work here. But what do we do in the meantime? Well, I think you buy a portfolio. You buy maybe the best forestry credits you can find, plus the most carbon removal that you can afford. Maybe you can spend $35 to $50 a ton and get something. And over time, you can populate it with higher and higher quality carbon removal as prices come down. You could even look at finding the highest quality carbon avoidance offsets. Just as Elizabeth was talking about earlier, they have a role. Just make them the best that you can find. In all this, I'd strongly suggest following the lead of big names like Sony, Microsoft, and Stripe as well. Microsoft are publishing really great work on this, particularly around these offset projects, the forestry projects, carbon removals. Stripe as well, they're really great. There is so much more to say about this. I see that the timer counting down. This is complicated stuff. There are lots of ways to get involved, but without necessarily going hardcore straight away. I would encourage you as much as possible, if you're in a similar situation, you're a mid-sized or a small studio, to look for the best bang for buck in however you want to get involved. You could give up your time as a business to a local charity doing some good for the environment, or you could look to start with like a limited measure of your footprint. Maybe you just look at scope 1 and 2, your electricity and your gas, and you just maybe offset that. Or maybe you get a calculator and just get started. Later, you could get a consultancy on board to help shortcut some of the learnings that you need to make. The point is, pick your level of investment to match your time, your situation, your context. You don't have to do it perfectly first time. We sure didn't. Thank you so much for listening. I'm keeping a list of some of the links that I allude to in my talks on this page here. Take a screenshot or a photo of it, feel free. You can hit up the URL if you want to do some typing instead. If you want to chat, my email's right there. Thank you so much for listening.